quiet town of Black Hollow, an old schoolhouse hides a dark secret: the teacher who never sleeps. When a curious fourth grader discovers his teacher's shadow twisting unnaturally, he and his friends uncover a tragic fire from 100 years ago and a dark ritual that refuses to stay buried. This is the story of the teacher who never slept and the children who dared to face his terrifying truth. The old school building stood at the edge of town, its cracked walls and faded paint hiding secrets no one dared to uncover. For decades, it had been a place of learning, laughter, and the occasional scolding from teachers. But beneath its ordinary appearance, something sinister lurked. The students whispered about strange noises in the hallways, flickering lights, and the eerie feeling of being watched. Yet, no one ever spoke of the most peculiar rumor of all: the one about Mr. Grayson, the fourth grade teacher who never seemed to sleep. Mr. Grayson had been at the school for as long as anyone could remember. His tall, thin frame and pale complexion made him stand out, but it was his eyes that truly unsettled people. They were dark, almost black, and seemed to pierce through anyone who dared to look into them. He was strict, rarely smiled, and always seemed to be in the classroom, no matter the time of day or night. Students joked that he lived in the school, but deep down, they wondered if there was some truth to it. One chilly autumn morning, a curious fourth grader named Ethan arrived at school early. He had forgotten his homework and needed to retrieve it before class started. The hallways were silent, the only sound the echo of his footsteps as he made his way to Mr. Grayson's classroom. As he approached the door, he noticed a faint light spilling from the crack beneath it. Strange, he thought. It was too early for anyone to be there. Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Something felt off, but his curiosity got the better of him. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking softly. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow coming from a single desk lamp. Mr. Grayson sat at his desk, his back to the door, hunched over something Ethan couldn't see. The teacher's movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were carefully examining whatever was in front of him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he noticed something unusual. Mr. Grayson's shadow on the wall didn't match his movements. It was larger, distorted, and seemed to writhe as if alive. Ethan's eyes widened in fear, but he couldn't look away. Suddenly, Mr. Grayson stopped moving. The room fell silent, and Ethan felt a cold chill run down his spine. Slowly, the teacher turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Ethan's. The boy froze, his body refusing to move. Mr. Grayson's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, and Ethan knew he had seen something he wasn't supposed to. Without a word, he turned and ran, his heart racing as he fled the classroom. He didn't stop until he was outside, the cold morning air biting at his skin. He knew he had discovered something terrifying, something he couldn't keep to himself. But who would believe him? It was October 2nd, 1973, in the small, remote town of Black Hollow, Texas. The town was surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, its isolation making it feel like a world unto itself. The school, Black Hollow Elementary, was the heart of the community, a place where generations of families had learned their ABCs and multiplication tables. But that year, something unusual began to unfold, something that would change the lives of 5 friends forever. Ethan couldn't shake the memory of what he had seen in Mr. Grayson's classroom. The distorted shadow, the teacher's piercing eyes, and the eerie silence haunted his thoughts. He knew he had to tell someone, but who would believe a 4th grader's wild story? He decided to confide in his 4 closest friends: Jake, the class clown; Mia, the quiet bookworm; Lucas, the curious tinkerer; and Emma, the brave and outspoken leader of their group. They met under the old oak tree at the edge of the schoolyard during recess, their usual spot for sharing secrets and making plans. Ethan's voice trembled as he recounted what he had seen. His friends listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to unease. Jake laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood, but even he couldn't ignore the chill that ran down his spine. Mia, always the logical one, suggested there might be a reasonable explanation, but her voice lacked conviction. Lucas, fascinated by mysteries, was eager to investigate, while Emma, though skeptical, couldn't ignore the fear in Ethan's eyes. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen to each of them. Jake stayed late after school to help clean the classroom and swore he saw Mr. Grayson standing in the hallway, motionless, staring at him with those dark, unblinking eyes. When Jake blinked, the teacher was gone, leaving only the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Mia, who often stayed behind to read in the library, noticed that the books on the shelves would shift when no one was around. One evening, she found an old, dusty yearbook from 1873, exactly 100 years earlier, on her desk. The pages were filled with faded photographs of students and teachers, but one face stood out: Mr. Grayson, looking exactly the same as he did now. Her hands shook as she slammed the book shut, her mind racing with questions. Lucas, who loved to tinker with gadgets, brought a small tape recorder to school to capture any unusual sounds. During lunch, he left it running in the empty classroom while he went to the cafeteria. When he played it back, he heard faint whispers, too soft to make out, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. He erased the recording immediately, afraid of what it might mean. Emma, the most skeptical of the group, decided to test the rumors herself. She stayed after school one evening, hiding in the supply closet near Mr. Grayson's classroom. As the hours passed, she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Her heart pounded as the door creaked open, and she saw Mr. Grayson standing in the doorway, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. He didn't say a word, just stared at her with those cold, dark eyes before turning and walking away. Emma waited until she was sure he was gone before bolting out of the closet and running home. The five friends met again under the oak tree, their earlier skepticism replaced by a growing sense of dread. They shared their experiences, each story more unsettling than the last. It was clear that Mr. Grayson was no ordinary teacher. But what was he? And why had he been at the school for so long? The friends decided to investigate further, determined to uncover the truth. They began by researching the history of Black Hollow and the school. At the town's small library, they found old newspaper articles and records dating back to the 1800s. One article, dated October 2nd, 1873, caught their attention. It described a tragic fire that had destroyed the original schoolhouse, claiming the lives of several students and teachers. Among the victims was a young teacher named Elias Grayson. The article mentioned that his body was never found, and some believed his spirit still haunted the town. The friends were stunned. Could their Mr. Grayson be the same Elias Grayson from 100 years ago? The idea seemed impossible, but the evidence was hard to ignore. They decided to dig deeper, searching for more clues about the fire and the mysterious teacher. What they discovered would lead them down a dark and dangerous path, one that would test their courage and force them to confront a terrifying truth. The five friends knew they were onto something, but they needed more proof. They decided to sneak into the school after hours, hoping to find evidence that would confirm their suspicions about Mr. Grayson. The plan was risky, but they had no other choice. They waited until the sun had set and the town had fallen into an uneasy silence before meeting at the edge of the schoolyard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air was thick with tension. Ethan led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they approached the back door of the school. Lucas, ever the gadget enthusiast, had brought a set of lock-picking tools he had borrowed from his older brother. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open and the door creaked inward. The friends exchanged nervous glances before stepping inside. The school was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of laughter and chatter replaced by an oppressive silence. The hallways were dark, the only light coming from their flashlights as they made their way to Mr. Grayson's classroom. The air felt colder the closer they got, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. When they reached the classroom, they found the door slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was just as he had seen it that morning, dimly lit, with Mr. Grayson's desk lamp casting a faint glow, but the teacher was nowhere to be seen. The friends spread out, searching for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. Mia noticed a stack of old papers on the desk, yellowed with age. She picked one up and gasped. It was a letter, dated October 2nd, 1873, written by Elias Grayson. The handwriting was shaky, as if the writer had been in a state of panic. The letter spoke of a terrible accident, a fire that had started in the schoolhouse. Elias had tried to save the students, but the flames had spread too quickly. In his final moments, he had made a desperate plea for help, but no one had come. As Mia read the letter aloud, the room seemed to grow colder. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing with each word. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, making them jump. They turned to see Mr. Grayson standing in the doorway, his dark eyes gleaming in the dim light. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that sent a chill down their spines. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and menacing. The friends froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Mr. Grayson stepped closer, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. The air grew heavier, and the room seemed to shrink around them. Ethan, trembling but determined, stepped forward. "We know who you are," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're Elias Grayson. You died in the fire 100 years ago." Mr. Grayson's expression darkened, and for a moment, the room was filled with an oppressive silence. Then he smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that sent shivers down their spines. "You're clever children," he said, "but some secrets are better left buried." Before they could react, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The friends huddled together, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light as they tried to make sense of what was happening. The air grew colder, and they could hear faint whispers echoing around them, growing louder with each passing second. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. The friends screamed, clutching each other as they were enveloped in darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Mr. Grayson was gone, leaving only the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. The friends were shaken but determined. They knew they had uncovered something far more terrifying than they had imagined. Mr. Grayson wasn't just a ghost, he was something else entirely, something that had been lurking in the shadows for over a century. And now they were in his sights. The friends stumbled out of the school, their hearts racing and their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The night air was cold, but it did little to calm their nerves. They huddled together under the old oak tree, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light as they tried to process what had just happened. Mr. Grayson, or whatever he was, had vanished, but the weight of his presence lingered, like a shadow clinging to their thoughts. "We need to figure out what he is," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If he's been here for 100 years, there has to be a reason. And if we don't stop him, who knows what he'll do next?" The others nodded, their earlier skepticism replaced by a grim determination. They knew they couldn't ignore what they had seen. But where to start? The library had provided some answers, but they needed more. Lucas suggested they visit the town's historical society, a small building on the edge of town that housed old records and artifacts. It was a long shot, but it was their best lead. The next day after school, the friends made their way to the historical society. The building was old and weathered, its wooden walls warped with age. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. An elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove greeted them, her eyes narrowing as she studied the group of nervous children. "What brings you kids here?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Ethan stepped forward, trying to sound confident. "We're doing a school project on the history of Black Hollow," he lied. "We were wondering if you could help us find information about the old schoolhouse and the fire that happened in 1873. Mrs. Hargrove's expression softened, and she nodded. "Ah, the fire. A tragic event, that was. Follow me." She led them to a small room filled with shelves of old books, documents, and photographs. The friends spread out, searching for anything that might shed light on Mr. Grayson's past. After what felt like hours, Mia found a dusty journal tucked away in a corner. The name on the cover sent a chill down her spine, Elias Grayson. She opened the journal carefully, the pages brittle with age. The handwriting was the same as the letter they had found in the classroom, but the entries were far more detailed. Elias Grayson had been a teacher, yes, but he had also been involved in something darker. The journal spoke of strange rituals, whispered incantations, and a desperate attempt to cheat death. The final entry, dated October 1st, 1873, was the most chilling of all. "Tomorrow I will perform the ritual," Elias had written. "If it works, I will no longer be bound by the limitations of this mortal body. I will become something more, something eternal. But if it fails, I fear the consequences will be dire." The friends exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear now that Elias Grayson had tried to use dark magic to escape death, and something had gone terribly wrong. The fire that had destroyed the schoolhouse hadn't been an accident. It had been the result of his failed ritual. And now he was trapped, neither alive nor dead, haunting the school for over a century. But why? What did he want? And why had he chosen now to reveal himself? As they left the historical society, the friends felt a growing sense of dread. They knew they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. But they also knew they couldn't walk away. They had to stop Mr. Grayson before he could harm anyone else. That night, they met at Ethan's house to plan their next move. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of what they had discovered hanging heavily in the air. Lucas suggested they search the school for clues about the ritual Elias had performed. If they could understand how he had become what he was, maybe they could find a way to undo it. The others agreed, though none of them relished the idea of returning to the school after dark. But they had no choice. They had to confront Mr. Grayson on his own turf. The next evening, they gathered at the schoolyard once more, their flashlights and backpacks filled with whatever tools they thought might help. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the school in an eerie darkness. As they approached the building, they noticed something strange. The windows of Mr. Grayson's classroom were glowing with a faint, unnatural light. The friends exchanged nervous glances but pressed on. They had come too far to turn back now. As they entered the school, they could hear faint whispers echoing through the hallways, growing louder as they approached the classroom. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold breeze seeped through the crack, sending shivers down their spines. Ethan pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted them made their blood run cold. Mr. Grayson stood in the center of the room, surrounded by strange symbols drawn on the floor in what looked like ash. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his shadow stretched unnaturally across the walls, twisting and writhing as if alive. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice echoing with a hollow, unnatural tone. "But now that you're here, you'll join me. Forever." The friends froze, their fear paralyzing them. But as Mr. Grayson stepped closer, his shadow reaching out like tendrils, they knew they had to act. They had uncovered the truth, but now they had to face the consequences. And they had to do it together. The room seemed to close in around the five friends as Mr. Grayson advanced, his shadowy tendrils stretching toward them like living things. The air grew colder, and the whispers they had heard in the hallway now swirled around them, forming words they couldn't quite understand but filled them with dread. Ethan, Jake, Mia, Lucas, and Emma stood frozen for a moment, their flashlights trembling in their hands. But then Emma, always the bravest, stepped forward. "We're not afraid of you," she shouted, her voice shaking but defiant. "You're not real. You're just a shadow." Mr. Grayson's lips curled into that same cold, unsettling smile. "Oh, I'm very real," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "And soon you'll be too. Forever." The shadowy tendrils lunged forward, wrapping around Emma's ankles and pulling her toward the center of the room. She screamed, thrashing against the darkness, but the tendrils were impossibly strong. Ethan and Jake rushed to her side, grabbing her arms and pulling with all their might. Mia and Lucas, meanwhile, began frantically searching the room for anything that could help, anything that could stop Mr. Grayson. Mia's eyes landed on the journal they had found at the Historical Society. It was lying on Mr. Grayson's desk, open to the page describing the ritual he had performed. Her mind raced as she scanned the words, looking for something, anything, that could give them an advantage. Then she saw it, a single line scribbled in the margin, almost too faint to read. "The ritual can be undone," it said, "but only by extinguishing the source of his power." Mia's heart leaped. "The desk lamp," she shouted, pointing to the faintly glowing lamp on Mr. Grayson's desk. "It's the source of his power. We have to break it." Lucas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy textbook from a nearby shelf and hurled it at the lamp. The glass shattered, and the light flickered before going out completely. For a moment, the room was plunged into darkness, and the whispers grew deafening. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the shadows recoiled, retreating into the corners of the room. Mr. Grayson let out a guttural roar, his form flickering like a dying flame. The tendrils holding Emma released her, and she scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The friends huddled together, their flashlights trained on Mr. Grayson as he writhed in the center of the room, his body twisting and distorting. "You think you've won?" he snarled, his voice distorted and inhuman. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal." But even as he spoke, his form began to dissolve, the shadows that made up his body unraveling like threads. The room grew brighter, the oppressive cold lifting as the whispers faded into silence. Mr. Grayson's dark eyes locked onto Ethan's one last time, filled with a mixture of rage and despair. Then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, he vanished, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and ash. The friends stood in stunned silence, their flashlights illuminating the empty room. The symbols on the floor were gone, as if they had never been there. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of Mr. Grayson's presence lifted. But the memory of what they had just witnessed would stay with them forever. "Is it over?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded slowly, though he wasn't entirely sure. "I think so," he said, "but we need to make sure." They spent the next hour searching the school, checking every corner and hallway for any sign of Mr. Grayson. But he was gone. The school felt different now, lighter, quieter, as if a great burden had been lifted. When they were finally satisfied that the danger had passed, they made their way outside, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. As they stood in the schoolyard, the friends exchanged weary but relieved smiles. They had faced something unimaginable and come out the other side, but they knew their lives would never be the same. They had uncovered a dark secret, one that had been buried for over a century, and they had paid a price for it. The memory of Mr. Grayson's cold, dark eyes would haunt them for years to come. The friends returned to their homes that morning, exhausted but relieved. They agreed to keep what had happened a secret, knowing no one would believe them. Life in Black Hollow slowly returned to normal, and the school felt different, lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. The students no longer whispered about strange noises or flickering lights, and Mr. Grayson's name faded from memory. But as the days turned into weeks, the friends began to notice something strange. Small, inexplicable things started happening to each of them. Ethan would wake up to find his bedroom window open, even though he was sure he had closed it the night before. Jake kept hearing faint whispers in the empty hallways of his house. Mia found her books rearranged on her shelves, as if someone had been searching for something. Lucas's gadgets would turn on by themselves, playing back recordings of static and faint, unintelligible voices. And Emma, who had always been the bravest, began having nightmares of Mr. Grayson's cold, dark eyes staring at her from the shadows. At first, they tried to brush it off, chalking it up to their imaginations. But the incidents grew more frequent and more unsettling. It was as if Mr. Grayson's presence had left a mark on them, a lingering shadow that refused to fade. They met under the old oak tree one afternoon, their faces pale and drawn. "Do you think he's still out there?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice heavy with unease. But something's not right. It's like he's still watching us. The friends decided to return to the school one last time, hoping to find answers. They searched every corner of the building, but there was no sign of Mr. Grayson. As they were about to leave, Ethan noticed something strange in the classroom. A faint, glowing symbol etched into the floor where Mr. Grayson had stood during the ritual. It was almost invisible, but it pulsed with a faint, eerie light. Before they could investigate further, the symbol began to fade, disappearing completely as if it had never been there. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, a sinking feeling in their stomachs. They had stopped Mr. Grayson, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly defeated him. Something lingered, something they couldn't see or understand. As they left the school, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground. Ethan glanced back at the building one last time, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the window of Mr. Grayson's classroom. A tall, thin figure with dark, piercing eyes. But when he blinked, it was gone. The story of Mr. Grayson and the 5 friends became a legend in Black Hollow, whispered about by students for years to come. Some believed it was just a tale, a spooky story to tell around campfires. But for Ethan, Jake, Mia, Lucas, and Emma, it was all too real. They had faced a darkness that defied explanation and survived, but they knew they would carry the scars of that night for the rest of their lives. As for Mr. Grayson, no one could say for sure what had become of him. He was gone, but the friends couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting in the shadows. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind howled through the trees, they would hear faint whispers, a reminder that some secrets are never truly buried. The story ends with a chilling question. Can evil ever truly be destroyed, or does it simply lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to return? The friends may never know the answer, but one thing is certain. They will never forget the teacher who never slept, and neither will you.